You've been taught to fear it, to avoid it, to run from it. Every warning, every conversation, every late-night anxiety has whispered the same message into your mind. Debt is dangerous. And you believed it. Because maybe you've seen what happens when it goes wrong. Maybe you've felt the pressure yourself, the quiet stress, the invisible weight that follows you into your mornings and sits beside you at night. But what if the problem was never the debt? What if the problem was how it was used? Because here is a truth most people never hear, and once you hear it, you can't unsee it. The same tool that traps one person can accelerate another into freedom. In this audiobook, Smart Debt Strategy, Make Loans Work for You, you're about to step into a completely different way of thinking about money, leverage, and control. Not hype, not fantasy, not shortcuts, but structure, clarity, discipline. This is not financial advice. This is education, perspective, and a shift in how you see one of the most misunderstood tools in modern life. Because in 2026, the rules have changed. AI is replacing jobs. Inflation is reshaping value. Opportunities move faster than savings can keep up. And in a world that moves this fast, waiting is no longer neutral. Waiting is a decision. So here's the roadmap for what you're about to experience. You'll learn the difference between destructive debt and strategic debt. You'll understand how the wealthy think about borrowing and why most people get it wrong. You'll break down the psychology that keeps people trapped in cycles of repayment, and step by step, chapter by chapter, you'll build a mindset that turns pressure into leverage. Because this is not about borrowing more. This is about thinking differently. Here's the line you need to remember. Debt doesn't decide your future. Your decisions decide what debt becomes. If that hits you, if you feel that shift already starting, stay with this. And if you're serious about changing how you think about money, take a second to commit to this journey. Like this audiobook as a signal to yourself, not to me, that you're ready to stop reacting and start understanding. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The lie you were told about debt. There's a quiet belief that shapes most financial decisions. It sounds responsible. It sounds safe. It even sounds wise. Stay out of debt. And on the surface, that sounds right. But here's the problem. It's incomplete because it doesn't teach you what debt is. It only teaches you to avoid it. And anything you avoid without understanding controls you. Think about it. Fear without knowledge creates paralysis, and paralysis keeps you exactly where you are. This is why most people stay stuck financially, not because they don't work hard, not because they lack intelligence, but because they were never taught how to use the tools available to them. As highlighted in the mindset shift seen in the difference between those who struggle and those who build wealth is not simply income. It's how financial tools are used with intention. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself, have you ever avoided something not because it was bad, but because you didn't fully understand it? That's what's happening here. Debt is not a personality trait. It's not good or bad. It's a tool. And like any tool, it depends on the hands that hold it. A hammer can build a house or destroy a window. The tool doesn't decide. The user does. And right now, most people are using debt emotionally. They borrow to feel better, to look better, to escape pressure, and that's where the trap begins. Because emotional borrowing always leads to logical consequences, and those consequences don't negotiate. You see it everywhere. The car that feels like success, but drains cash every month. The vacation that creates memories, but lingers as interest payments long after the photos are gone. The lifestyle that looks impressive, but quietly suffocates freedom. And here's the hardest truth to accept. Most people don't realize they're in the trap until it's already built around them, because it doesn't feel like a trap at first. It feels like progress. That's the illusion. And breaking that illusion is where your power begins. Because once you see it, you can't go back to thinking the same way. You start asking different questions. Not, can I afford this, but what does this cost me over time? Not, do I want this, but will this move me forward? Not, is debt bad, but what kind of debt am I creating? That shift is everything. And here's your first principle. Never borrow money to impress people who are not responsible for your future. Because every time you do, you trade long-term control for short-term validation. And validation is one of the most expensive habits you can afford. Now imagine this. What if instead of using debt to consume, you used it to build? What if instead of borrowing to feel rich, you borrowed to become financially stronger? That's where this journey changes direction, because there is a version of debt that works for you, but you don't discover it by accident. You discover it through discipline, through awareness, through understanding what most people ignore. And in the next chapter, we step into the line that separates financial growth from financial pressure. The line that decides whether debt becomes your burden or your leverage. And once you see that line clearly, you will never cross it blindly again. Dear viewer, we now have over 150 videos on our channel. That's a huge number, and we want to thank you, our viewers and subscribers, so much for that. You inspire us to create great videos every time and choose the best topics for our audiobooks. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time to do so. We have big plans for this channel. Thank you. Chapter 2. The line between burden and leverage. There is a line. You can't see it on paper, banks don't highlight it, and no contract will warn you when you cross it. But it's there, and that invisible line separates people who stay stuck from those who quietly move ahead. On one side of the line, debt consumes you. On the other side, debt builds you. Same word, same system, completely different outcomes. So, what is that line? It's simple, but not easy. Consumption versus creation. Most people borrow to consume. They take money from the future to enjoy something in the present. And again, there's nothing inherently wrong with enjoying life. But the problem is this. When your present is funded by your future gets weaker every time. Think about that carefully. Every payment you commit to without return reduces your flexibility, reduces your options, reduces your ability to take risks when real opportunities appear. And in a fast-moving world like 2026, flexibility is power. Now let's flip it. What does it look like to borrow for creation? It means you are not just spending money. You are directing it. You are placing it somewhere with the expectation, not hope, expectation, that it will produce something. Income, skill, access, opportunity. That's the shift. And it's not emotional, it's mathematical. As echoed in the difference isn't the loan itself, it's whether the borrowed money builds something that returns value or something that drains it. So now ask yourself honestly, when you've borrowed in the past, what were you really buying? Comfort, status, relief, or something that could grow? There's no judgment here, only awareness, because awareness is where control begins. Now let's go deeper. Imagine two people take the exact same loan, same amount, same interest rate, same timeline. One uses it to upgrade their lifestyle, better car, better apartment, better image. The other uses it to build something. Maybe it's a small business, maybe it's a skill that increases their income, maybe it's an asset that generates cash flow. 5 years pass. The first person is still paying for something that no longer excites them. The second person has something that pays them back. Same starting point. Different thinking. Different result. This is why debt feels like a trap for some and a ladder for others. Because most people don't evaluate debt based on outcome. They evaluate it based on desire. And desire is not a strategy. Now, here's where it gets uncomfortable, because once you understand this, you can't blame the system anymore. You can't say debt is bad as a blanket statement. You have to ask better questions, harder questions. Questions like, what is this going to produce? How long will this payment limit me? Am I buying something that grows or something that fades? And here's a powerful truth you need to carry forward. If the debt doesn't have a clear path to return, it's not leverage, it's liability. Simple, not easy, but simple. And this is where discipline enters the picture, because knowing the difference is one thing. Acting on it consistently is something else entirely. You will feel the pull, the urge to upgrade, the temptation to reward yourself early, the quiet voice that says, you deserve this now. And maybe you do. But the real question is, can you afford to deserve it right now, or are you borrowing that feeling at the cost of your future stability? That's the tension. That's the moment where most people slip. And that's why most people stay stuck. Because they don't lose control all at once. They lose it in small, justified decisions, over and over again. So here's your second principle. Never take on debt without defining what it will return. Not guessing, not hoping, defining. Because clarity protects you, and confusion costs you. Now imagine what happens when you start applying this. Every decision slows down. Every option gets evaluated. Every loan becomes intentional. You stop reacting. You start choosing. And that is where power begins. But there's something even deeper beneath this. Because even when people understand the difference, many still fall into the trap. Why? Because this isn't just about money. It's about psychology. It's about identity. It's about the silent patterns that drive decisions without you even noticing. And in the next chapter, we go inside that. We break down the mental habits that make smart people use debt in dangerous ways, and how to rewire them, so your decisions finally match your goals. Because until your thinking changes, your strategy won't hold. Chapter 3. The Psychology of Borrowing. Most people think debt is a financial issue. It's not. It's a behavioral issue. Because money doesn't make decisions. People do. And people are emotional long before they are logical. That's where everything begins. Not in the numbers, not in the interest rate, not in the contract, but in the moment right before you say yes. That quiet moment where a decision is made, sometimes fast, sometimes impulsive, sometimes disguised as, I've thought this through. But underneath it, there's always a driver, a reason. And if you don't understand that reason, you will repeat the same patterns, no matter how much you learn. So let's slow this down. Why do people really take on bad debt? Not the surface answer. The real answer? It's not because they're careless. It's not because they're lazy. It's because of emotional triggers. Stress, comparison, impatience, fear of missing out, and the most dangerous one of all, identity. Because when people borrow to match an identity, they stop thinking about consequences. They start thinking about perception. How will this make me look? How will this make me feel? What will people think if I don't? And just like that, logic disappears. Now here's the part most people avoid hearing. You are not just managing money. You are managing your impulses. And if your impulses are not trained, no strategy will protect you. This is why someone can learn everything about finance and still make destructive decisions. Because knowledge without discipline is powerless. There's a pattern that shows up again and again. You see someone online living a certain life. You compare, you feel behind. And instead of building patiently, you accelerate artificially. You borrow speed. But speed without foundation always collapses. As reflected in, many people mistake access for progress. Just because you can borrow doesn't mean you're advancing. And that's the trap. Because borrowing creates the illusion of progress. You feel like you're moving forward. But in reality, you've only moved the timeline of your payments forward, not your position. That's a dangerous illusion. Now pause. Think about the last time you made a financial decision quickly. What were you feeling in that moment? Excitement? Pressure? Relief? Those emotions matter more than the purchase itself. Because if you don't control the emotional trigger, you will repeat the behavior. Different situation, same pattern and patterns. Shape outcomes. So here's where the shift happens. You stop asking, is this a good deal? And you start asking, what is driving this decision? Because when you understand the driver, you regain control. Now let's go deeper. There are 3 psychological traps that lead to destructive debt. The first is urgency. Limited time. Last chance. Act now. Urgency kills analysis. It pushes you to decide before you think. And when decisions are rushed, mistakes multiply. The second is normalization. Everyone is doing it. This is just how life works. It's normal to have payments, but normal doesn't mean optimal. And following the crowd financially often leads to average results at best and pressure at worst. The third is emotional justification. I've worked hard. I deserve this. I need this right now. And maybe you do deserve something, but the question is, does your future self agree with this decision? Or are you making them pay for your present emotions? That's the real cost. Because debt doesn't disappear. It transfers from present you to future you. And future you has to live with every decision you make today. So here's your third principle. Never make a borrowing decision in an emotional state. Not excited, not stressed, not pressured. Because emotion distorts judgment. And distorted judgment creates long-term consequences. Instead, create distance. Pause. Step away. Come back when your mind is clear, because clarity creates control, and control creates better outcomes. Now imagine this version of yourself. You don't react, you don't rush, you don't justify, you evaluate. You think in timelines, you think in outcomes, you think in long-term positioning. That version of you is almost impossible to trap, because traps rely on reaction. And you've removed the reaction. That's power. But there's something even more important than avoiding bad decisions. It's learning how to make strategic ones, because once you control your psychology, you're ready for the next level, using debt intentionally, not as a shortcut, but as a calculated move. And in the next chapter, we step into the strategy itself, how to identify opportunities where borrowing actually makes sense, and how to evaluate them with precision, not guesswork. Because the goal is not to avoid debt forever. The goal is to make it work for you. Chapter 4. Strategic Debt. When borrowing becomes power. There comes a moment when fear turns into clarity. A moment when you stop asking, "How do I avoid debt?" and start asking, "When does debt actually make sense?" That question alone separates passive thinking from strategic thinking, because avoiding everything risky might feel safe, but it also limits growth. And in a world that rewards calculated action, playing only defense keeps you behind. So let's step into the next level. Strategic debt, not emotional, not reactive, not impulsive, but intentional. Because there are moments in life where borrowing is not just acceptable, it's logical. But only if certain conditions are met. And if even one of these conditions is missing, what looks like an opportunity becomes a liability. So listen carefully. The first condition is clarity of return. If you borrow money, you must know exactly how that money will produce value. Not "it might," not "I hope," but how. Step by step. Because vague plans create precise problems. Let's say you borrow to learn a skill. That can be powerful, but only if that skill has real demand and you have a plan to apply it. Otherwise, you've just borrowed for potential without a path to execution. And potential without action does not pay back loans. Now the second condition, control. Can you influence the outcome, or are you relying entirely on external factors? Because if your success depends only on things you can't control, you're gambling, not strategizing, and debt amplifies outcomes. If things go right, it accelerates growth. If things go wrong, it accelerates pressure. So control matters more than confidence, more than optimism. Control. Now the third condition, time alignment. This is where most people make critical mistakes. They borrow short-term for something that takes long-term to produce results. And that mismatch creates pressure, because now the payment arrives before the return does. And pressure forces bad decisions, quick fixes, desperate moves, compromises, all because the timeline wasn't aligned. So here's a rule you need to remember. The return must come before, or at least match, the obligation. If it doesn't, you're creating stress, not leverage. Now let's bring this together. Clarity, control, time alignment. Miss one, and the structure weakens. Miss all three, and it collapses. But when all three are present, debt transforms. It stops being a burden and becomes a tool, a multiplier. Now think about this. Why do some people move forward faster even when they don't start with more? It's not luck, it's leverage. They understand how to use time, money, and opportunity together. They don't wait for perfect conditions. They prepare and then act with precision. And sometimes that action involves borrowing. But here's the difference. They don't borrow to escape their situation. They borrow to improve their position. That's a completely different mindset. And mindset drives outcomes. Now let's make this real. Imagine you identify an opportunity. You've studied it. You understand it. You've tested it in small ways. You know the potential, and you know what's required to scale it. At that moment, borrowing might not be reckless, it might be efficient, because instead of waiting years to accumulate capital, you accelerate the timeline, but only because you've done the work first. Preparation always comes before leverage, never after. This is where discipline shows up again, because most people want the acceleration without the preparation. They want the outcome without the foundation, and that's why they fail, because debt magnifies reality. If your foundation is weak, it exposes it faster. If your structure is strong, it expands it faster. So here's your fourth principle. Never use debt to create opportunity. Use debt to expand opportunity that already exists. That distinction is everything, because when opportunity already exists, you are not guessing. You are scaling. And scaling is predictable when done correctly. Now imagine operating like this. You don't chase every option. You don't jump on trends. You don't react to hype. You build quietly. You test patiently. You understand deeply. And when the moment comes, you move decisively. That's how leverage works. Not loudly, not emotionally, but strategically. And most people will never reach this level because they never master the basics. They stay stuck in reaction, in fear, in avoidance, or in impulsive action. But you're not here for that. You're here to understand, to see clearly, to operate differently. And this is where the game begins to shift, because now you're not just avoiding mistake, you're preparing for calculated moves. But there's one more layer to this, because even with strategy, even with discipline, there is still risk, always. And the next chapter is where we face that directly, not to avoid it, but to learn how to control it. Because the people who win long-term are not the ones who avoid risk. They're the ones who understand it and manage it better than everyone else. Hey there, we want to remind you that we often choose topics suggested by you, our viewers, in the comments. In the comments, you can suggest a topic or ask a question about what you'd like to see in our video. We read every comment carefully, so we promise not to miss a single one. Thank you. Let's keep going. Chapter 5. Risk, the truth most people avoid. Let's remove the illusion. There is no such thing as risk-free debt. None. It doesn't matter how smart the plan sounds, how confident you feel, or how many people say, this is a great opportunity. There is always risk. And the moment you pretend there isn't, you lose control. Because denial is the most dangerous financial position you can take. Now, here's where most people get it wrong. They think avoiding risk is the goal. It's not. Because avoiding all risk also means avoiding growth. And in a world that is constantly evolving, standing still is its own kind of risk. So the real objective is not avoidance, it's management. Understanding risk so clearly that it no longer surprises you. Because surprises are what destroy people financially. Unexpected payments, unexpected losses, unexpected delays. And most of those unexpected situations were actually predictable. They just weren't considered. So let's bring clarity to this. There are 3 types of risk you must learn to see. The first is financial risk. Can you afford the downside? Not the best case scenario. Not the optimistic projection. The downside. If things don't go as planned, can you still breathe? Can you still operate, or does everything collapse? Because if one decision can break your entire system, that decision is too big, too fragile, too exposed. Strong strategies don't rely on perfection. They survive imperfection. Now the second type. Execution risk. This is where most people overestimate themselves. They assume they will follow through. They assume they will stay disciplined. They assume they will perform consistently. But assumptions don't repay loans. Execution does. And execution is harder than planning. It requires consistency. When motivation fades, focus. When distractions increase, discipline. When results are delayed. So the real question becomes, are you capable of executing this plan, not just starting it? Because starting is easy, finishing is rare. Now the third type, external risk, things you cannot control, market shifts, economic changes, industry disruptions. And in 2026, this matters more than ever because the world is moving faster than it ever has. AI is reshaping industries overnight. New platforms are creating opportunities and removing them just as quickly. What works today might not work tomorrow. So if your entire plan depends on stability, you're building on unstable ground. And that's where awareness becomes your advantage. Because when you acknowledge external risk, you prepare for it. You build flexibility into your plan. You don't assume everything will go right. You assume something will go wrong, and you plan accordingly. That's not pessimism, that's precision. Now, let's connect this to reality. Why do so many people fail when using debt? Not because the idea was terrible, but because the risk was ignored. They saw the upside, but not the downside. They saw the opportunity, but not the pressure. And when pressure arrived, they weren't ready. As reflected in the difference is not just in access to money, but in the discipline and awareness behind how it's used. That awareness is what protects you. So here's your fifth principle. Never take on risk you haven't fully defined, not partially, not emotionally, fully. Because defined risk can be managed. Undefined risk manages you. Now imagine this version of yourself. You don't get excited too quickly. You don't commit too easily. You don't assume the best without preparing for the worst. You think in scenarios, best case, expected case, worst case. And you ask one simple question. Am I still okay in the worst case scenario? If the answer is no, you adjust, you scale down, you wait, you rethink. Because patience is part of strategy and restraint is a form of intelligence. Now here's where things shift again. Because once you understand risk, you stop fearing it. And when you stop fearing it, you start using it carefully, strategically, intentionally. Because risk is not the enemy. Uncontrolled risk is. And this is where you begin to move differently from most people. You don't avoid opportunities, but you don't chase them blindly either. You evaluate, you prepare, you position yourself, and when you move with awareness. That's what creates long-term stability. Not luck, not guessing, but controlled decisions, repeated over time. Now, here's the truth most people never accept. The goal is not to win fast. The goal is to survive long enough to win big. And survival requires structure, which brings us to the next level. Because understanding risk is one thing, building a system that protects you from it is something else entirely. And in the next chapter, we break down how to create that system. A structure that allows you to use debt without letting it control you. Because without structure, even the smartest strategy will eventually fail. Chapter 6. Build the system before you borrow. Most people think control comes after the decision. It doesn't. Control is built before the decision is ever made. And this is where almost everyone gets it wrong. They focus on the opportunity, They focus on the potential. They focus on the outcome. But they ignore the structure. And without structure, even a good opportunity can collapse under pressure, because pressure doesn't test your idea. It tests your system. So before you ever take on debt, you need something far more valuable than confidence. You need a framework, a system that holds you steady. When emotions rise, when uncertainty appears, when things don't go exactly as planned, because they won't. Now let's break this down. A strong financial system is not complicated, but it is intentional, and it has 3 core layers. The first layer is stability. This is your foundation, your ability to handle life without panic. Because life will happen. Unexpected expenses, delays, changes, and if your entire financial structure is stretched to its limit, one disruption can break everything. So before you think about leverage, ask yourself this: do I have breathing room? Not abundance, not perfection, breathing room. Because without it, you are building on pressure, and pressure leads to bad decisions. Now the second layer, separation. This is where discipline becomes visible, because most people mix everything together. Income, expenses, debt, opportunities, all blurred into one flow, and when everything is mixed, clarity disappears. So you need separation, clear lines. What is essential? What is optional? What is investment? What is risk? Because when you separate, you see. And when you see, you can decide properly. Now here's the truth most people avoid. If you can't manage small amounts with clarity, you won't manage large amounts any better. More money doesn't fix confusion. It amplifies it. So separation is not about complexity. It's about awareness. Now the third layer, discipline of tracking. This is where most people resist. Because tracking feels restrictive. It feels uncomfortable. It forces you to face reality. But reality is where power lives. Because what you don't track, you don't control. And what you don't control eventually controls you. So before you borrow anything, you should already know your numbers. Not roughly, not approximately, clearly. Income, expenses, commitments. Because debt adds another layer. And if the base layer is unclear, the entire structure becomes unstable. As reinforced in discipline and precision are what turn financial tools into advantages instead of burdens. This is that precision. Now imagine this version of you. You know exactly where your money goes. You understand your capacity. You have space to absorb pressure. You are not guessing. You are operating. That's a different level of control. And from that level, decisions become sharper, cleaner, more intentional. Now let's go deeper. Because building a system is not just about numbers. It's about behavior. It's about how you respond under pressure. Because pressure reveals truth. If your system only works when things are easy, it's not a system. It's a temporary arrangement. Real systems hold when things get uncomfortable, when income fluctuates, when expenses increase, when results are delayed. And this is where discipline becomes non-negotiable, not extreme discipline. Consistent discipline, the kind that doesn't depend on mood, the kind that doesn't disappear when motivation fades. Because remember this, debt creates obligation, and obligation does not wait for motivation. So your system must operate, whether you feel like it or not. That's maturity. That's control. Now here's your 6th principle. Never add complexity to a system that isn't stable, because debt adds complexity. And if your foundation is already unstable, You are stacking pressure on top of pressure. That's how people collapse financially, not from one big mistake, but from multiple small misalignments layered together. Now pause for a moment. Be honest. If you added a new financial obligation today, would your system hold, or would it stretch? Would it stay stable, or would it rely on everything going perfectly? Because if it relies on perfection, it's already fragile, and fragile systems don't survive pressure. So before you move forward, build your structure quietly, patiently, without rushing, because this part is invisible. No one sees it. No one applauds it. But it changes everything, because when the opportunity comes, and it will, you won't hesitate. You won't panic. You won't guess. You will know. And knowing is what allows you to move with confidence, without being reckless. Now this is where things start to come together. You understand the difference between consumption and creation. You understand your psychology. You understand risk. You are building structure, but there is still one critical piece missing. Because even with all of this, most people still hesitate. Not because they don't understand, but because they don't trust themselves. And in the next chapter, we go into that. How to build the kind of self-trust that allows you to make decisions and stand behind them. Because strategy without self-trust always leads to hesitation, and hesitation is where opportunities disappear. Chapter 7. Self-trust. The missing foundation. There is a moment that defines everything. It's quiet. No one sees it. No one hears it. But it decides the direction of your life. It's the moment you have to trust yourself, not your friends, not the opinions around you, not the noise of the internet, yourself, because you can have the best strategy in the world. You can understand debt, risk, structure, timing. But if you don't trust your own decisions, you will hesitate. And hesitation is expensive. Opportunities don't wait for certainty. They don't pause while you overthink. They move. And if you're not ready to move with them, you watch them pass. So let's talk about why self-trust is so rare. It's not because people are incapable. It's because they've broken it repeatedly. Every time you say you'll do something and don't, self-trust weakens. Every time you avoid responsibility, self-trust weakens. Every time you make a decision and then doubt it endlessly, self-trust weakens. And over time, you stop believing in your own judgment. So even when you understand what to do, you don't act. That's the hidden cost. And it shows up everywhere. In missed opportunities, in delayed decisions, in constant second-guessing. Now here's the truth. Self-trust is not built through success. It's built through consistency, through small promises kept daily. Because trust is not about being perfect. It's about being reliable to yourself. As echoed in, real change begins the moment you take ownership, not just of outcomes, but of your actions and decisions every single day. That ownership builds trust. Now let's bring this into your financial life. If you don't trust yourself, every decision feels risky, even the good ones, because you're not just evaluating the opportunity, you're questioning your ability to handle it, and that hesitation creates paralysis. But when self-trust is strong, something changes. You don't rush, you don't panic, you evaluate, and then you decide. And once you decide, you commit. That's power. Not because you're always right, but because you are stable. Now here's where it gets deeper. Self-trust doesn't mean blind confidence. It doesn't mean ignoring risk. It means knowing that whatever happens, You will respond. You will adjust. You will take responsibility. That's the difference. Most people are afraid of making the wrong decision. But the real fear is not trusting themselves to handle the consequences, so they avoid deciding at all. And avoidance is still a decision, just one that keeps you stuck. Now imagine this shift. Instead of asking, what if this goes wrong? You ask, if this goes wrong, how will I respond? That question changes everything because it brings you back into control. You stop fearing outcomes and start preparing for them. That's maturity. That's growth. And that's what allows you to use tools like debt without being controlled by them. Now let's make this practical. How do you build self-trust? Not in theory, in reality. You start small. You make commitments and keep them. Not big, dramatic ones, simple ones. Tracking your finances consistently, following through on your plans, sticking to your decisions long enough to see results. Because every time you follow through, you send a signal to yourself. I can rely on me. And that signal compounds day after day, decision after decision, until something shifts. You stop needing constant reassurance. You stop looking for validation. You start operating from internal clarity. That's when things change, because now, when an opportunity appears, you don't freeze, you don't overanalyze endlessly, you assess, you decide, you move, and if it works, you build. If it doesn't, you learn. But either way, you grow. Now, here's your seventh principle. Never rely on a decision you don't trust yourself to execute, because execution is where results are created. Not in the idea, not in the plan, in the follow-through. And follow-through requires trust. Now pause. Think about your past decisions. Not just what you chose, but how you handled them. Did you stay consistent? Did you adapt when needed? Did you take responsibility or avoid it? Because your future decisions will be shaped by those patterns. But here's the good news. Patterns can change, starting now, with awareness, with intention, with discipline. Because self-trust is not something you're born with. It's something you build. And once it's built, everything becomes easier, clearer, stronger. Now you're no longer reacting to life. You're directing it. And this is where everything starts to align. You understand debt. You understand risk. You've built structure. You're developing self-trust. But there's one final shift that takes this to another level. Because even with all of this, most people still think too small. They think in survival, in safety, in limitation, and in the next chapter. We break that. We step into how to think in scale, because once you learn how to think bigger while staying disciplined, debt stops being something you fear and becomes something you can use with precision. Chapter 8. Thinking in scale, expanding without losing control. Most people don't fail because they think too big. They fail because they think too small for too long. They stay in survival mode. Just enough income, just enough stability, just enough comfort to avoid change, but never enough to create real freedom. And when you think like that, every financial decision becomes defensive. How do I avoid losing? How do I stay safe? How do I not fall behind? But very few ask, how do I actually move forward? That's the shift. Because survival thinking protects you, but it also limits you. And if you stay there too long, you build a life that feels stable on the surface, but stagnant underneath. Now listen carefully. Thinking in scale does not mean being reckless. It does not mean chasing big numbers or taking blind risks. It means understanding how to expand without losing control. Because growth without control always collapses. So let's define what scale actually means. Scale means increasing output without increasing effort at the same rate. It means using systems, leverage, and strategy to multiply results. And this is where debt can become powerful, not dangerous, not emotional, but powerful because when used correctly, it compresses time. It allows you to move faster than your current resources would normally allow, but only if you're ready. That's the part most people skip. They want to scale before they stabilize. They want acceleration without foundation, and that's why they fall. Because scaling amplifies everything, your strengths, your weaknesses, your discipline, or lack of it. As reflected in, leverage accelerates outcomes, but it does not correct flawed thinking. It exposes it. So before you think about scaling, you must ask yourself, is what I'm doing repeatable? Because scale requires repetition. If your income depends on random effort, random results, or inconsistent behavior, there is nothing to scale, only something to fix. Now imagine this. You have a system that works, not perfectly, but consistently. You understand it, you can predict it, you can improve it. At that point, scaling becomes logical, because now you are not guessing. You are multiplying something proven, and this is where debt can enter the picture strategically, not as a shortcut, but as an accelerator. Because instead of waiting to grow slowly, you expand faster based on something that already works. That's intelligent leverage. Now here's where discipline becomes even more important. Because when things start working, people get comfortable. They relax. They stop paying attention, and that's when mistakes happen. Because scale increases responsibility. More money, more decisions, more pressure. And if your mindset doesn't evolve with your growth, you lose control. So thinking in scale also means thinking in systems, not just how do I earn more, but how do I manage more? Because earning is only half the equation. Management is what sustains it. Now let's go deeper. There are 3 stages of financial thinking: survival, stability, scale. Most people stay stuck in the first 2. They work to survive. Then they work to maintain stability, but they never transition into scale because they fear losing what they've built, and that fear keeps them small. Now here's the truth. If you never learn to scale, you will always trade time for money, and time is limited. So at some point, you must expand. But you must do it intelligently, with awareness, with structure, with discipline. Now here's your 8th principle. Never scale chaos, only scale clarity. Because if your system is messy, scaling will not fix it. It will multiply the mess. But if your system is clear, scaling will multiply results. Now pause for a moment. Think about where you are right now. Are you surviving, stabilizing, or ready to scale? Be honest. Because clarity about your position determines your next move. And there's no rush. Scaling too early is just as dangerous as never scaling at all. Timing matters, preparation matters, and patience matters more than most people realize. Now imagine this version of yourself. You're not chasing fast wins. You're not reacting to trends. You're building something solid step by step. And when the time comes, you expand, not emotionally, but strategically. That's how real growth happens, quietly, consistently, powerfully. Now this is where everything starts to connect. You understand debt. You control your psychology. You manage risk. You've built structure. You trust yourself. You're thinking in scale. But there's still one more layer that separates those who grow from those who plateau. Because growth is not just about money. It's about identity. And in the next chapter, we go deeper than strategy. We go into who you become when you start operating at this level, because your identity will either support your growth or sabotage it. Dear viewers, write which city you're from. It's interesting to see which corners of the world are watching our videos. Chapter 9. Identity, who you become when you use debt wisely. There is something deeper than strategy, deeper than numbers, deeper than systems, deeper than discipline. It's identity. Because at the highest level, money does not respond to what you know. It responds to who you are. And this is where most people unknowingly sabotage themselves. They learn strategies. They understand concepts. They even start applying them. But internally, they still see themselves the same way: cautious, reactive, uncertain, dependent on external validation. And that identity limits every decision they make. Because no matter how much you learn, you will always fall back to the version of yourself you believe you are. So, if you still see yourself as someone who struggles with money, you will make decisions that reflect that. If you see yourself as someone who avoids risk, you will hesitate when opportunity appears. If you see yourself as someone who hopes things work out, you will never operate with precision. That's the hidden barrier, not knowledge, identity. Now, let's shift this. What does the identity of someone who uses debt wisely look like? They are not emotional with money. They are not reactive. They are not chasing validation. They are measured. They think in timelines. They think in outcomes. They think in responsibility. They don't rush decisions, but they don't avoid them either. They don't fear debt, but they don't respect it blindly. They understand it, and that understanding creates calm, because calm is a sign of clarity, and clarity leads to better decisions. Now, here's the truth most people don't want to hear. You cannot build a different financial life with the same identity. Something has to change, not dramatically, not overnight, but intentionally, because identity is built through repetition, through how you think, how you act, and what you tolerate. As reinforced in it, your life begins to shift the moment you take ownership, not just of your actions, but of the standard you hold yourself to. That standard defines your identity. Now let's go deeper. Identity is not what you say. It's what you consistently do. You can say you're disciplined, but if your actions are inconsistent, your identity reflects inconsistency. You can say you're strategic, but if your decisions are emotional, your identity reflects reaction. So the question becomes, who are you when no one is watching? When there is no pressure, no urgency, no external validation? Because that version of you is the one making your real decisions. Now imagine this shift. You start seeing yourself as someone who operates with control, someone who understands leverage, someone who does not panic under pressure. That identity changes everything. Because now, when a decision appears, you don't react based on fear. You respond based on alignment. Is this consistent with who I am becoming? That question filters everything, every opportunity, every risk, every decision, and over time, your results begin to reflect that identity. Now here's where it becomes powerful, because identity is not fixed, it's shaped. every single day, through small actions, small decisions, small moments of discipline. And those small moments compound until one day you realize something has changed. You're no longer guessing. You're no longer reacting. You're operating. That's the shift. Now here's your ninth principle. Never make financial decisions that contradict the identity you are building, because every contradiction weakens your progress, and every aligned decision strengthens it. Now pause. Think about the identity you've been operating from, not what you want to be, but what your actions show. Are you consistent? Are you disciplined? Are you intentional? Or are you reactive? Impulsive? Uncertain? Be honest, because awareness is the first step to change, and change is what creates growth. Now imagine this version of you again, calm, focused, clear, not rushed, not pressured, not influenced by noise. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to impress anyone. You are building with intention. That's power, and quiet power lasts. Now this is where everything begins to align, because once your identity matches your strategy, your actions become consistent, and consistency is what creates results. But there's one more challenge waiting, because as you grow, as you become more disciplined, more aware, more strategic, you will face something most people don't talk about. Pressure, not external pressure, internal pressure. The pressure of responsibility, the pressure of higher standards, the pressure of knowing more and needing to act accordingly. And in the next chapter, we face that directly, because growth is not just about gaining control, it's about handling the weight that comes with it. And if you're not prepared for that weight, even the strongest strategy can break. Chapter 10. The weight of responsibility. There is a version of growth that feels exciting. New ideas, new opportunities, new ways of thinking. It feels like progress. But then there is another version of growth, quieter, heavier, less talked about. The moment when you realize you are responsible now, not just for your decisions, but for their consequences, not just for your progress, but for your discipline. And this is where many people slow down, not because they don't understand what to do, but because they feel the weight of doing it, because knowledge changes things. Once you see clearly, you can't go back to ignorance. You can't pretend you don't know better. And that awareness creates pressure, internal pressure, the kind that says, you know what needs to be done. And that voice doesn't go away. Now here's the truth. Responsibility is not comfortable. It never has been, but it is necessary, because without responsibility, there is no control. And without control, there is no growth. So the question becomes, can you handle the weight? Not perfectly, not effortlessly, but consistently. Because consistency under pressure is what separates those who grow from those who retreat. Now let's bring this into your financial decisions. When you start using debt strategically, you are stepping into a higher level of responsibility, because now your decisions have leverage. They don't just affect today, they affect months, years, timelines, and that changes how you think, or at least it should, because every decision carries more weight, more consequence, more impact, and that can feel overwhelming if you're not prepared. As reflected in air, discipline is not about doing what feels good. It's about doing what must be done, especially when it's uncomfortable. This is one of those moments. Now here's where most people struggle. They want the rewards of growth, without the responsibility that comes with it. They want progress without pressure. They want results without discipline. But it doesn't work that way because responsibility is the price of control, and control is the foundation of growth. Now let's go deeper. Responsibility is not just about big decisions. It's about small ones, daily ones, the choices you make when no one is watching, the habits you maintain or break, the discipline you apply or avoid, because those small decisions carry weight too, and over time, they define your direction. Now imagine this. You wake up every day knowing exactly what you need to do, not guessing, not hoping, knowing. And instead of avoiding it, you step into it, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's repetitive, even when it's not exciting. That's responsibility. And that's where real growth happens, not in big moments, but in consistent ones. Now, here's the shift you need to make. Stop seeing responsibility as pressure and start seeing it as power. Because responsibility means you are in control, you are not waiting, you are not reacting, you are deciding, and that changes everything. Now let's bring this back to debt, because when used correctly, debt increases your responsibility, but it also increases your potential. It forces you to operate at a higher level, to think more clearly, to act more intentionally. And if you handle it well, it strengthens you. But if you avoid that responsibility, it exposes you. That's the truth. Debt does not create pressure. It reveals how you handle pressure. So here's your 10th principle. Never take on responsibility you are not prepared to carry consistently, not occasionally, not when you feel like it, consistently. Because inconsistency breaks structure, and broken structure creates chaos. Now pause. Think about where you are right now. Are you avoiding responsibility, delaying decisions, waiting for the right time, hoping things will become clearer, or are you stepping into it, taking ownership, making decisions, moving forward even when it's uncomfortable? Because that difference defines your trajectory. Now imagine this version of yourself. You don't run from pressure, you don't avoid responsibility, you carry it. With calm, with clarity, with discipline. You don't panic when things get heavy, you adjust, you adapt, you keep moving. That's strength, real strength, not loud, not visible, but consistent. And consistency wins. Now this is where your journey deepens, because you're no longer just learning concepts. You're becoming someone who can apply them under pressure, in reality. And that's where most people fall behind. They understand, but they don't execute. But you're different now. You're building something stronger, something more stable, something that can handle growth without breaking. Now there's one more shift waiting, because as you take on more responsibility, you also gain something else, control over your direction. And in the next chapter, we step into that, how to move from reacting to life, to actively designing it. Because once you reach that level, debt is no longer something you manage, it becomes something you position as part of a bigger strategy. Chapter 11, From Reaction to Design. Most people don't live their financial lives. They react to them. Bills arrive. They respond. Opportunities appear. They hesitate. Problems show up. They adjust. Everything is reactive. Nothing is intentional. And when you live like that, you are always one step behind, always catching up, always adjusting, always responding to something that already happened. That's not control. That's survival. in motion. But there is another way to operate, a higher level, where instead of reacting, you design. You think ahead. You position yourself. You make decisions before pressure forces you to. And that shift changes everything. Because when you design your financial life, you are no longer at the mercy of circumstances. You are directing them. Now let's slow this down. What does it actually mean to design your financial life? It means you don't wait for problems to appear. You anticipate them. You don't wait for opportunities to become obvious. You prepare for them. You don't let money dictate your decisions. You use money to support your direction. That's design. And it requires a completely different mindset. Because now, you're not just thinking about today, you're thinking about timelines. 6 months, 1 year, 3 years. Where are you going? What are you building? What are you positioning yourself for? Because without direction, every decision becomes random. And random decisions create inconsistent results. Now, here's the truth most people avoid. If you don't design your life, someone else will influence it through systems, through expectations, through pressure. And before you realize it, you're living a version of life that was never intentional. That's why design matters. Now let's bring this into your use of debt, because this is where it becomes powerful. When you operate reactively, debt controls you. It shows up as an obligation, a response, a pressure. But when you operate intentionally, debt becomes part of a plan, a tool, a lever, a strategic move within a larger system. That's the shift. And it's not about borrowing more. It's about placing debt correctly within your design. Now imagine this. You know where you're going, not perfectly, but clearly enough. You have a direction, and every decision you make aligns with that direction, including debt. You don't borrow randomly, you borrow with purpose. You don't react to opportunities, you prepare for them. That's design. Now let's go deeper. Design requires clarity, and clarity requires time. You have to step away from noise, from distractions, from constant input, and think, reflect. Ask yourself real questions. What am I building? What do I actually want? What kind of life am I designing? Because if you skip this step, everything else becomes guesswork. And guesswork is expensive. Now here's where discipline shows up again, because designing your life is not a one-time decision. It's a continuous process. You adjust, you refine, you improve, because life changes, markets change, opportunities change, and your design must evolve with it. But the key difference is this: you are adjusting intentionally, not reacting blindly. As reinforced in, time becomes powerful when used with intention. When you stop drifting and start directing your energy toward growth. That's what you're doing here. You're directing. Now here's your 11th principle. Never make financial decisions without understanding how they fit into your long-term design. Because isolated decisions create fragmented results, but aligned decisions create momentum, and momentum is what moves you forward faster than effort alone. Now pause. Think about your current situation. Are your decisions aligned, or are they scattered? Are you building something or just managing what's in front of you? Because that difference defines your future. Now imagine this version of yourself. You wake up with clarity. Not perfect clarity, but direction. You know what you're working toward, and every decision you make supports that. You don't waste energy on things that don't matter. You don't get pulled in different directions. You stay focused. That's power. not loud power, not visible power, but internal control. And internal control creates external results. Now this is where everything begins to elevate. You are no longer reacting to life. You are designing it. You are positioning yourself. You are thinking ahead. And that changes how you use every tool, including debt. But there's still one more layer to this, because even with design, even with clarity, there is something that can disrupt everything: distraction, the constant pull of noise, the endless stream of information, the pressure to move fast without thinking deeply. And in the next chapter, we confront that directly, because in a world full of noise, the ability to stay focused is one of the most valuable skills you can build. And without it, even the best design will never be executed. Dear viewer, share your success story, even if it is small. It can motivate other people to visit the comment section and read it, and it can inspire them. Also, don't be shy about asking questions, and perhaps someone with more experience or someone who has been through this will share the answer. Remember, it is only through communication that people become stronger and better. Thank you. Chapter 12. Focus. Protecting your financial mind. In a noisy world, there has never been a time like this. Information everywhere, advice from every direction, opinions, trends, opportunities, flooding your attention every single day. Scroll for 5 minutes, and you'll see 10 different ways to make money, 15 different warnings about losing it, and 100 voices telling you what you should be doing right now. And here's the problem. When you listen to everything, you understand nothing, because clarity does not come from more information. It comes from focused thinking. And without focus, even the strongest strategy falls apart, because execution requires attention, and attention is under attack. Now, let's bring this into your financial life. You've built awareness. You understand debt. You've developed structure, discipline, identity, and design. But if your focus is weak, none of it holds, because you will get distracted, pulled into trends, pulled into noise, pulled into decisions that don't align with your plan. And slowly, without even realizing it, you drift. That's how most people lose progress. Not through one big mistake, but through constant small distractions. Now pause, ask yourself honestly, how often do you change direction? How often do you start something, then switch to something else before seeing results? That pattern destroys momentum, and without momentum, even good decisions don't compound. Now here's the truth. Focus is not about doing more. It's about doing less, better, choosing what matters and ignoring everything else. And that's hard, because the world rewards speed. Act fast. Don't miss out. Jump on this now. But speed without clarity creates mistakes, and mistakes cost time, cost money, cost energy. As reinforced in, real progress comes from focusing on your path, not constantly reacting to everything around you. That's what you're building here. Focus. Now, let's go deeper. There are 3 types of distraction you must learn to control. The first is external noise. Social media, news, opinions, all constantly pulling your attention away from your own thinking. And the danger is not just distraction, it's influence. Because when you consume too much, you start thinking like everyone else, and thinking like everyone else leads to average decisions. Now the second type, internal distraction. Overthinking, doubt, constantly questioning your decisions. This one is subtle. because it feels productive, but it's not. It's delay. It's hesitation disguised as thinking, and it keeps you stuck. Now the third type, opportunity overload. Too many options, too many ideas, too many directions, and when everything looks possible, nothing gets executed. Because execution requires commitment, and commitment requires focus. Now, here's the shift you need to make. You don't need more options. You need fewer, better ones. And once you choose, you commit, not forever, but long enough to see results. That's where growth happens, not in starting, but in continuing. Now imagine this version of yourself. You are not constantly checking for the next move. You are not reacting to every new idea. You are focused, calm, clear, directed. You know what you're building, and you protect your attention like it matters, because it does. Now let's connect this back to debt, because focus changes how you use it. Without focus, debt becomes scattered, used here, used there, no clear direction, and scattered debt creates scattered results. But with focus, debt becomes aligned, directed, intentional, part of a clear strategy. That's the difference. Now here's your 12th principle. Protect your focus more than you protect your money. Because focus determines how money is used, and how money is used determines your outcomes. Now pause again. Look at your habits. Where is your attention going? What are you feeding your mind daily? Because your input shapes your decisions, and your decisions shape your future. Now imagine eliminating the noise, not completely, but intentionally, reducing distraction, limiting input, focusing on what matters. That clarity changes everything, because now you are not reacting. You are executing, and execution is what creates results. Now this is where your growth becomes visible, not to others, but to you. You feel it. The difference in how you think, how you decide, how you move. You are no longer scattered. You are aligned, and alignment creates momentum. But there's one more challenge ahead, because even with focus, even with discipline, even with clarity, there is something that can still break everything. Impatience, the need for results now, the pressure to move faster than reality allows. And in the next chapter, we confront that, because patience is not passive. It is one of the most powerful strategic advantages you can develop, and without it, even the best plan falls apart before it has time to work. Chapter 13, Patience, the discipline of letting strategy work. There is a silent force that destroys more progress than failure ever will. It's not lack of knowledge. It's not lack of opportunity. It's not even lack of discipline. It's impatience, the need to see results now, the urge to speed things up before they are ready, the quiet pressure that whispers, this should be working faster. And that pressure breaks people, because strategy takes time. Growth takes time. Compounding takes time. But most people don't give it enough. Now listen carefully. Impatience doesn't feel like weakness. It feels like urgency, like ambition, like drive. But when it's not controlled, it leads to poor decisions, rushed moves, forced actions, abandoning systems that haven't had time to work. And that's where progress collapses, not because the plan was wrong, but because it was interrupted. As reinforced in real transformation happens through consistent action over time, not sudden bursts of effort followed by abandonment. That's the truth most people avoid. Now, let's bring this into your financial life. You've built awareness. You've created structure. You understand risk. You're thinking strategically. But if you expect immediate results, you will sabotage yourself, because debt, when used correctly, is not a quick win. It's a calculated move within a timeline, and timelines require patience. Now here's the reality. When you make a smart financial decision, you often won't see results right away. There's a delay, a gap between action and outcome, and that gap is where most people lose, because in that gap, doubt appears. Did I make the right choice? Should I change direction? Is this working? And if you're not grounded, you react. You adjust too early. You switch too fast. You abandon what could have worked. That's impatience in action. Now imagine this. You plant a seed, and every day you dig it up to check if it's growing. What happens? It never grows, because growth requires time and trust. The same applies here. Now, this doesn't mean you ignore reality. Patience is not blind waiting. It's active discipline. You monitor, you evaluate, you adjust when necessary, but you don't panic, you don't rush, you don't expect overnight transformation, because you understand that real progress is built quietly. Now let's go deeper. Impatience often comes from comparison. You see others moving fast, earning more, scaling quicker, and you feel behind. But what you don't see is their timeline, their preparation, their risks, their context. You are comparing your process to someone else's highlight, and that distortion creates pressure, unnecessary pressure. So here's the shift. Stop measuring your progress against speed. Start measuring it against consistency. Are you showing up? Are you following your system? Are you making aligned decisions? Because that's what compounds, not speed. Consistency. Now here's your 13th principle. Never abandon a sound strategy before it has time to produce results, because time is part of this strategy, not separate from it. Now pause. Think about your past. How many times did you quit something that could have worked if you had stayed consistent a little longer? How many times did impatience cost you progress? That awareness matters, because it changes how you move forward. Now, imagine this version of yourself. You are not rushing. You are not chasing quick wins. You are steady, focused, disciplined, committed to the process. You trust your system. You trust your decisions. And you give them time to work. That's power. Not loud, not dramatic, but consistent. And consistency always wins in the long run. Now let's connect this back to debt, because patience transforms how you use it. Without patience, debt becomes pressure, something you want to escape quickly, something that feels heavy. But with patience, debt becomes a tool, a structured obligation aligned with a timeline, something you manage while your strategy unfolds. That's the difference. Now this is where your mindset evolves again. You are no longer chasing fast results. You are building sustainable ones and sustainable results. Last. Now here's the next challenge, because even with patience, even with focus, even with discipline, there is still one factor that determines everything: your environment, the people around you, the conversations you engage in, the influences you allow into your thinking, because environment shapes behavior, and behavior shapes results. So in the next chapter, we step into that. How to build an environment that supports your growth instead of quietly working against it. Because no matter how strong your strategy is, if your environment pulls you backward, you will struggle to move forward. Chapter 14, Environment, the invisible force behind every decision. There is something shaping your life right now, even when you don't notice it. Something influencing your decisions, your habits, your standards, your environment, the people you listen to, the conversations you engage in, the content you consume daily. All of it is shaping how you think. And how you think shapes how you act. And how you act shapes your financial reality. That's the chain. Now here's the problem. Most people try to change their results without changing their environment. They want better decisions while staying in the same influences. And that rarely works because environment is powerful. It normalizes behavior. If everyone around you spends impulsively, that feels normal. If everyone avoids risk completely, that feels normal. If no one around you thinks strategically about money, that becomes your baseline. And baseline defines your ceiling. As reflected in growth requires focus on your own path, but that focus becomes almost impossible if your environment constantly pulls you in different directions. That's why environment matters. Now let's go deeper. There are 3 layers to your environment. The first is physical, where you spend your time, your home, your workspace, your daily surroundings. Are they structured? Are they distracting? Do they support clarity or chaos? Because your physical space affects your mental state, and your mental state affects your decisions. Now the second layer, social environment. The people you interact with regularly, friends, colleagues, family. What are their beliefs about money? Do they think long-term to live moment to moment? Do they support discipline or normalize shortcuts? Because whether you realize it or not, you absorb patterns, you adapt to the expectations around you, and over time, those patterns become your own. Now the third layer, digital environment. This is the most overlooked and the most powerful in 2026. What you watch, what you read, what you scroll through daily, because every piece of content is shaping your perception of money, of success, of what's possible. And if your digital environment is filled with noise, fast wins, unrealistic expectations, constant comparison, your thinking becomes distorted. And distorted thinking leads to poor decisions. Now, here's the shift. You don't need to change everything overnight, but you do need to become intentional, because environment is not something you control once. It's something you manage continuously. Now imagine this. You start removing noise. Not all of it, but enough. You reduce distractions. You limit negative influences. You choose what you expose yourself to. And slowly, your thinking changes. Your standards rise. Your decisions improve. That's the power of environment. Quiet, but consistent. Now let's bring this back to debt, because environment affects how you use it. If your environment normalizes consumption, you will feel pressure to spend. If your environment lacks discipline, you will struggle to stay consistent. If your environment rewards appearances, you will be tempted to borrow for image, not value. But if your environment supports growth, everything changes. You think differently. You act differently. You decide differently. That's alignment. Now here's your 14th principle. Design an environment that makes disciplined decisions easier, not harder, because willpower alone is not enough. You need support, structure, alignment. Now pause. Look at your environment honestly. Not what you want it to be, but what it actually is. What influences are shaping your thinking daily? What patterns are being reinforced without you even noticing. Because awareness is the first step to control. Now imagine this version of yourself. You are selective, not closed off, but intentional. You choose your inputs carefully. You protect your focus. You surround yourself with ideas and people that support your growth. That's strength, not loud, not obvious, but powerful. Because over time, your environment becomes your advantage. Now this is where everything starts to accelerate. Because when your environment supports your strategy, execution becomes easier. Consistency becomes natural. Growth becomes sustainable. But there's still one more layer. Because even in the right environment, even with discipline, clarity, and structure, there is something that can still break progress. Complacency. The moment when things start working and you relax too much. You stop pushing. You stop refining. You stop growing. And slowly, without noticing, you lose momentum. So in the next chapter, we face that directly. Because staying disciplined at the beginning is one thing. Maintaining it when things get easier is something else entirely. Chapter 15. Complacency, the silent killer of progress. There is a moment that feels like success. Things start working, decisions begin to pay off. Pressure eases just a little. And in that moment, most people relax. Not consciously, not intentionally, but subtly. They stop tracking as closely. They loosen their discipline. They assume, I've figured it out. And that assumption is where progress begins to slow. Because success is not maintained automatically. It requires the same discipline that created it, and sometimes even more. Now listen carefully. Complacency doesn't feel dangerous. It feels comfortable. It feels like relief, like you've earned a break. And to a certain extent, you have. But here's the truth. There is a difference between rest and complacency. Rest is intentional. You pause to recover, so you can continue stronger. Complacency is passive. You drift, you ease off, you assume things will continue on their own, and they don't. Because systems require maintenance. Focus requires protection. Discipline requires reinforcement. Strategy requires adjustment. And the moment you stop maintaining, things begin to slip, slowly, quietly, until one day you realize you're no longer moving forward. Now let's bring this into your financial life. When you start using debt strategically and it begins to work, that's when complacency becomes most dangerous. Because now you feel confident, maybe even comfortable, and that comfort can lead to carelessness. Small decisions become less intentional. Risks become slightly larger. Discipline becomes slightly weaker. And those small shifts compound, as reflected in discipline is not a one-time effort. It is a continuous decision, especially when things feel easier. That's the part most people forget. Now, let's go deeper. Complacency often shows up in three ways. The first is overconfidence. You've had success, so you assume future success is guaranteed. You stop questioning your decisions. You stop evaluating risks as carefully. And that's when mistakes happen, because confidence without awareness becomes vulnerability. Now, the second form, neglect. You stop paying attention to the details. Tracking becomes inconsistent. Planning becomes less precise. You assume everything is under control without verifying it, and what you don't monitor eventually drifts. Now the third form, comfort addiction. You start prioritizing ease over growth. You avoid discomfort. You avoid challenge. You stay where things feel manageable. Instead of pushing forward and slowly, your growth plateaus. That's complacency. Now here's the shift. You don't need to fear success, but you do need to respect it. Because maintaining progress requires intention every single day. Now imagine this version of yourself. You achieve results, but you don't relax your standards. You stay sharp. You stay aware. You continue refining your system. Even when things are working, that's how momentum is sustained. Not through intensity, but through consistency. Now here's your 15th principle. Never let short-term success weaken long-term discipline. Because success is not the finish line. It's a new level of responsibility. Now pause. Think about moments in your life when things were going well. Did you stay consistent or did you relax too early? Because those moments reveal your patterns, and patterns define your trajectory. Now imagine maintaining your discipline even when things feel easier, even when results are coming in, even when there is less pressure. That consistency creates stability, and stability creates freedom. Now let's connect this back to debt, because disciplined use of debt requires ongoing attention. You don't just set it and forget it. You monitor, you adjust, you stay aware, because leverage amplifies everything, and if your discipline weakens, the impact becomes larger. That's the responsibility, but also the opportunity. Now this is where you begin to operate differently. You are not driven by emotion. You are not controlled by comfort. You are consistent, and consistency builds something powerful, not just financially, but mentally. You become someone who follows through, someone who maintains standards, someone who does not drift. That identity is rare, and it's valuable. Now this is where your journey continues to evolve, because you've built awareness, you've built discipline, you've built structure. But there's still one final layer that determines how far you can go. Adaptability. Because no matter how strong your system is, the world will change, markets will shift, opportunities will evolve, new challenges will appear. And if you can't adapt, you will fall behind. So in the next chapter, we step into that. How to stay flexible while staying disciplined. Because the people who succeed long-term are not the ones who stay rigid. They are the ones who adjust without losing their foundation. Chapter 16, Adaptability, Staying Strong. While the world changes, there is one truth that no strategy can escape. Things will change, markets will shift, opportunities will evolve. Systems that work today may not work tomorrow, and in a world moving as fast as 2026, change is not occasional, it's constant. Now here's where most people struggle. They build a plan and then try to hold on to it, no matter what. They stay rigid, attached to what worked, even when it stops working. And slowly, without realizing it, they fall behind because they confuse discipline with rigidity. But they are not the same. Discipline is consistency in principles. Rigidity is resistance to change. And if you confuse the two, you will break under pressure. Now listen carefully. The strongest people are not the ones who never change. They are the ones who adapt without losing their foundation. That's the difference. They stay grounded in their principles, but flexible in their execution. And that's what allows them to survive and grow in any environment. Now let's bring this into your financial life. You've built structure, you've developed discipline, you understand strategy, but if you can't adapt, all of that becomes fragile because no system is perfect forever and no opportunity lasts indefinitely. As reinforced in our success with leverage depends on awareness and adjustment, not blind commitment to a single path. That awareness is adaptability. Now let's go deeper. Adaptability is not about constantly changing direction. It's not about chasing every new trend or reacting to every shift. It's about knowing when to adjust and when to stay consistent. That balance is what creates long-term stability. Now here are 3 signs you need to adapt. The first is when results stop matching effort. You're doing the same work, but outcomes are declining. That's a signal, not to panic, but to evaluate. Because something has changed, and ignoring that leads to stagnation. Now the second sign, external shifts, market changes, new technologies, new competitors, things outside your control that affect your environment. You can't ignore these, but you also shouldn't overreact. You observe, you analyze, you adjust strategically. Now the third sign, internal misalignment, when your strategy no longer fits your goals. Because growth changes you, what worked at one stage may not serve the next. And if you don't adjust, you outgrow your own system. Now here's the key. Adaptation must be intentional, not emotional. You don't change because you feel uncertain. You change because you see clearly. That's the difference. Now imagine this version of yourself. You are not rigid. You are not reactive. You are aware. You monitor your environment. You evaluate your results. You adjust when necessary, but you don't abandon your foundation. Your principles stay strong. Discipline, clarity, intentional decision-making. Those don't change. Only the method evolves. Now let's connect this back to debt, because adaptability changes how you manage it. Without adaptability, debt becomes fixed, rigid, unadjusted, disconnected from reality. But with adaptability, debt becomes flexible. Something you manage actively. You adjust strategies. You refine timelines. You respond to changes with awareness. That's control. Now here's your 16th principle. Stay committed to your principles, but flexible in your execution. Because principles guide you, but execution moves you. And movement requires adjustment. Now pause. Think about your past. Were there moments when you held on to something too long, a plan, a strategy, an idea, even when it was no longer working? That's rigidity, and it costs progress. But there are also moments when you adapted too quickly, changed direction without enough thought, reacted instead of evaluated. That's instability. And it also costs progress. So the goal is balance. Now imagine operating from that balance. You are steady, but not stuck. Flexible, but not reactive. You adjust, but with intention. That's strength. And that strength allows you to navigate anything. Now this is where your growth reaches another level, because you are no longer dependent on one strategy. You are building the ability to adapt and continue. And that ability is what creates long-term success. But there is still one final layer, because even with adaptability, even with discipline, even with clarity, there is something that determines how far you go. Vision. Not just short-term goals, but long-term direction. Because without vision, adaptability turns into randomness. So in the next chapter, we step into that. How to define a clear financial vision that guides every decision you make. Because once your vision is clear, everything else becomes easier. Chapter 17, Vision, the direction that makes every decision clear. There is a question most people avoid asking themselves, not because it's difficult to understand, but because it demands honesty. Where are you actually going? Not next week, not next month, but long term. What are you building? Because without a clear answer, everything becomes reactive. You make decisions based on what's in front of you instead of what you're moving toward. And when there is no direction, even good decisions feel uncertain. Now listen carefully. Vision is not about predicting the future. It's about defining direction. It's about knowing what matters to you, what you are building toward, what kind of life you are designing. Because once that becomes clear, everything changes. Your decisions become simpler. Your priorities become sharper. Your discipline becomes easier to maintain. Because now, you are not guessing. You are aligning. As reflected in real progress begins when you take ownership of your direction, not just your actions. That ownership is vision. Now let's go deeper. Most people confuse goals with vision. Goals are specific, short-term, measurable. Vision is broader, long-term, directional, guiding. Goals change. Vision anchors you. And without that anchor, you drift from one idea to another, from one opportunity to the next, never building anything fully. That's the cost of unclear vision. Now imagine this. You know what you're building, not perfectly, but clearly enough. You know the kind of financial life you want: freedom, flexibility, stability, growth. And every decision you make moves you closer to that. That's alignment. And alignment creates momentum. Now let's bring this into your use of debt, because vision changes everything. Without vision, debt is random, used for convenience, used for impulse, used without direction. But with vision, debt becomes strategic, a tool used to accelerate what you are already building. That's the shift. You don't borrow because you can. You borrow because it fits your direction. Now here's where it becomes powerful. Because when your vision is clear, you stop chasing distractions. You stop reacting to noise. You stop making decisions that don't align, because you know where you're going. And that clarity filters everything. Now let's go deeper. Vision also creates patience, because you understand that what you're building takes time. You're not rushing. You're not forcing outcomes. You're moving with intention. And that intention creates stability. Now imagine this version of yourself. You wake up with direction. Not perfect certainty, but clarity. You know what matters. You know what doesn't. And that makes decisions easier, faster, stronger, because you're not debating every option. You're aligning every option. That's the difference. Now, here's your 17th principle. Never take on debt that does not move you toward your long-term vision, because misaligned decisions create resistance, and resistance slows progress. Now pause. Think about your current direction, not what you say you want, but what your actions show. Are your decisions aligned, or are they scattered? Because your results reflect your direction. Now imagine tightening that alignment. Every decision supporting your vision, every move intentional. That creates something powerful, momentum. And momentum is what turns small actions into big results over time. Now this is where everything begins to connect. You understand debt. You control your psychology. You manage risk. You've built structure. You trust yourself. You think in scale. You protect your focus. You develop patience. You shape your environment. You avoid complacency. You adapt. And now, You have vision. This is a different level because now you are not just reacting to life, you are building it, step by step, decision by decision. Now there is only one final stage left because knowledge without action changes nothing. And in the next chapter, we bring everything together into execution because execution is where transformation happens. Chapter 18, Execution, where everything becomes real. There is a moment where everything you've learned meets reality. Not in theory, not in planning, not in reflection, but in action. Because no matter how much you understand, how clearly you think, how strong your vision is, nothing changes until you execute. That's the line. The difference between knowing and becoming. Now listen carefully. Execution is not about intensity, it's about consistency. Because anyone can act once. Anyone can feel motivated for a day, a week, maybe even a month. But real progress is built through repetition, through showing up again and again, even when it's not exciting, even when it's difficult, even when results are not immediate. That's execution. As reinforced in, discipline is doing what must be done, even when you don't feel like it. This is where that discipline lives. Now let's bring everything together. You understand the difference between consumption and creation. You've mastered your psychology. You know how to manage risk. You've built structure. You trust yourself. You think in scale. You protect your focus. You practice patience. You shape your environment. You avoid complacency. You adapt. You've defined your vision. All of that leads to this moment, execution. Because without it, everything stays potential. And potential does not change your life. Now here's where most people fail. Not at the beginning, but in the middle. They start strong, clear, focused, but then life happens. Distractions return, motivation fades, doubt appears, and slowly they stop, not completely, but enough to break momentum. And without momentum, progress stalls. Now here's the truth. Execution is not about perfection. You will make mistakes. You will adjust. You will learn. But you must continue because continuation is what creates results. Now imagine this. You commit to your plan, not perfectly, but consistently. You track your progress. You adjust when needed. You stay aligned with your vision. And over time, things begin to shift. Not dramatically at first, but steadily. Your decisions improve. Your discipline strengthens. Your results start to compound. That's execution in motion. Now let's go deeper. Execution requires three things. The first is clarity. You must know what to do, not vaguely, not generally, specifically, because unclear actions create inconsistent results. Now the second, consistency. You must repeat those actions long enough to see results, not just when you feel like it, but especially when you don't. Now the third, adjustment. You must evaluate, refine, improve, because no plan is perfect, and improvement is part of the process. Now here's the shift. You don't need to do everything. You need to do the right things. Consistently. That's it. Now imagine operating like this. No overthinking, no constant hesitation. You know your next move, and you take it. Day after day, decision after decision. That's how transformation happens. Not in big moments, but in consistent ones. Now let's connect this back to debt, because execution determines how it affects you. Without execution, debt becomes pressure, something that builds without return. But with execution, debt becomes leverage, something that works with you as your strategy unfolds. That's the difference. Now here's your 18th principle. Execution turns knowledge into results. Without it, nothing changes. Now pause. Be honest with yourself. How many things do you already know, but haven't applied? How many ideas, plans, strategies are still waiting for action? Because that gap between knowing and doing is where most people stay stuck. Now imagine closing that gap, not all at once, but step by step, action by action. That creates something powerful, momentum, and momentum changes everything. Now this is where your journey becomes real, because you are no longer just learning, you are applying, you are building, you are moving forward, and that movement is what creates results. But there is one final layer, because execution gets you started. But something else keeps you going long term. Resilience, the ability to continue, even when things don't go as planned, even when setbacks appear, even when progress feels slow. And in the next chapter, we go into that, because resilience is what determines whether you stop or continue. And continuing is what creates success. Chapter 19, Resilience, the ability to continue when it gets hard. There is a part of the journey that no one celebrates. No applause, no recognition, no visible progress, just effort, uncertainty, and silence. This is where most people stop, not because they are incapable, but because they are unprepared for resistance. Because no matter how strong your strategy is, no matter how clear your vision becomes, you will face moments where things don't go as planned. Results take longer, obstacles appear, setbacks happen. And in those moments, your knowledge is not what matters most. Your resilience is. Now listen carefully. Resilience is not about avoiding difficulty. It's about continuing through it, not blindly, not recklessly, but with awareness and persistence. Because growth is not linear, it moves in waves. Progress, pause, adjustment, progress again. And if you expect constant upward movement, you will get discouraged. But if you understand the process, you stay steady. As reflected in, discipline shows up most when things feel hardest. And that's exactly where resilience is built. Now let's bring this into your financial journey. When you begin using debt strategically, you are stepping into responsibility. And responsibility comes with pressure. There will be moments when returns are slower than expected, when challenges appear, when doubt starts to creep in. And in those moments, you have two options: retreat or respond. Most people retreat. They panic. They abandon their strategy. They make emotional decisions to escape pressure, and those decisions create bigger problems because they are reactive. But resilient people respond. They don't ignore the problem. They face it calmly, clearly, with intention. They adjust where needed. They reinforce their discipline. They continue moving forward. That's resilience. Now let's go deeper. Resilience is built through three things. The first is perspective, understanding that setbacks are part of the process, not a sign of failure, but a signal to adjust. Because every challenge contains information, and if you look for it, you improve. Now the second, emotional control. Not reacting immediately, not making decisions under pressure, but pausing, thinking, responding with clarity. Because emotional decisions create long-term consequences. Now the third, commitment, staying aligned with your vision, even when it's difficult, even when it's slow, even when it's uncomfortable. Because commitment is what carries you through uncertainty. Now imagine this version of yourself. You face challenges, but you don't collapse. You adjust. You learn. You continue. You don't panic when things go wrong. You respond. That's strength. Not loud, not visible, but powerful. Now let's connect this back to debt, because resilience changes everything. Without resilience, debt becomes overwhelming. Every setback feels like failure. Every delay feels like pressure. And eventually, you try to escape it. But with resilience, debt becomes manageable. You understand that timelines can shift, that challenges can appear. That adjustment is part of the process. And you stay in control. That's the difference. Now here's your 19th principle. Resilience is not about avoiding failure. It's about continuing through it. Because continuation creates results. Now pause. Think about your past. Moments when things didn't go as planned. How did you respond? Did you adjust or did you retreat? Because those moments reveal your patterns, and patterns define your future. Now imagine responding differently, calmly, intentionally, with control. That changes everything. Because now, setbacks don't stop you. They refine you. They make you sharper, stronger, more aware. And that awareness improves your decisions. Now this is where your transformation becomes real. Because you're no longer dependent on perfect conditions. You are capable in imperfect ones, and that is what creates long-term success. Now there is only one final layer left, because you've built everything: awareness, discipline, structure, focus, patience, adaptability, vision, execution, resilience. But now, it's time to bring it all together, to step into full control. And in the next chapter, we reach that final stage where everything connects and you operate with clarity, confidence, and control. Chapter 20, Integration. When everything connects. There is a point where everything stops feeling separate. No more scattered ideas, no more disconnected strategies, no more uncertainty about what to do next. Everything begins to connect. Your thinking, your discipline, your decisions, all aligned. This is the moment where you stop learning pieces and start operating as a whole. Now listen carefully. Most people never reach this stage, not because they can't, but because they stop too early. They learn enough to feel comfortable, but not enough to become consistent. As reinforced in the real difference is not in the tool itself, but in how it is used with discipline, awareness, and purpose. That's the truth, and now you see it clearly. Now here's the final shift. You stop asking, is debt good or bad? And start asking, does this decision move me forward? That question becomes your filter for everything. Now imagine your life from this point forward. Every decision intentional, every action aligned, every move part of a bigger design. You are no longer reacting. You are building quietly, consistently, powerfully. Now this is where most people would end, but not you. Because this is not the end. It's the beginning of a different way of thinking, a different way of operating, a different way of living. Now before you go, take a moment, pause, reflect. What is the one thing that hits you the hardest? What is the one shift you know you need to make? Hold on to that, because that's your starting point. Now here's your commitment. If this resonated with you, don't just listen, act. Even if it's small, track your finances more clearly. Pause before your next financial decision. Evaluate one opportunity with precision. Start, because starting is what separates intention from transformation. And if you made it this far, you're not here by accident. You're here because something in you is ready to change. Now, one final thought to carry with you. A single line. That defines everything you've just experienced. You don't rise by avoiding pressure. You rise by learning how to use it. Remember that, because it will guide you long after this audiobook ends. And if this journey gave you clarity, share it with someone who needs it, because most people are still trapped, not by debt, but by how they think about it. And you now see differently. So the question is, what will you do next?